João was a boy with a shy smile and eyes full of dreams, despite the harsh reality surrounding him. He grew up in a modest home where the sound of his mother's sewing machine and conversations about the next bill to pay were part of everyday life. The house, small and simple, always smelled of fresh coffee and homemade bread, a reflection of his family's efforts to keep food on the table, even if the meals were humble. He was a smart, curious boy, interested in the world beyond the walls of his home and the dirt roads where he lived. At school, he stood out not only for his perfect grades, but also for the refined manners his mother always insisted on teaching him. "Never let the little we have define who you are," she would say, and João carried those words with him wherever he went. His friendship with Lucas, a boy from his class, seemed unlikely. Lucas came from a wealthy family, with a well-known last name and always dressed impeccably. He didn't know what it was like to struggle, nor did he understand the burden João carried on his shoulders. Even so, the two were inseparable at school, sharing laughs, exchanging secrets, and dreaming together about the future. However, for João, there was always an invisible gap between their worlds. That difference had never been so clear until the day Lucas invited him to visit his house. João, hesitant, accepted the invitation, curious to see what it was like to live in his friend's world. Little did he know that day would forever change his view of friendship and the reality around him. When Lucas invited João to visit his home, João's heart nearly jumped out of his chest. It was the first time he had the chance to see his friend's world up close, a universe he had only known through brief descriptions and distant glimpses. The idea of walking through those vast hallways, seeing the luxury furniture and the garden Lucas often talked about, filled him with excitement. In the days leading up to the visit, João could hardly concentrate in class. His mind wandered, imagining what was behind those tall gates he always saw from afar while riding the bus home. Was there a private cinema? A swimming pool the size of a soccer field? He had heard so many stories about mansions but never thought he'd actually set foot in one. The night before, João looked at his best clothes, a shirt he wore on special occasions and the cleanest pair of shoes he owned. He knew that compared to what Lucas had, his wardrobe was modest, but that didn't matter. To him, the friendship he had with Lucas was more important than any material difference. "It'll be fun," João thought as he looked at himself in the mirror, trying to fix his hair. He was determined to make that afternoon special. He believed that visiting Lucas's house would only strengthen their bond and maybe show Lucas that he too could be part of that world. He couldn't wait to live this new experience, convinced that it would be a day to remember, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to see up close what he had only ever dreamed about. João arrived at the mansion, wide-eyed, almost unable to believe what he was seeing. The wrought iron gate opened slowly, revealing a vast, perfectly manicured garden with fountains that sparkled in the afternoon sun. He had never seen anything so impressive. Trees sculpted into geometric shapes lined the entrance, and the white stone path seemed to gleam like diamonds. As he climbed the marble steps to the front door, his legs trembled a little. His heart raced, caught between excitement and nerves. Lucas's mansion was larger than anything he could have imagined. He had heard stories about houses like this, but standing there in front of doors so tall they nearly touched the ceiling felt surreal. The facade was flawless, with towering columns and enormous windows where sheer curtains fluttered in the light breeze. When the door opened, João was greeted by a servant whose gaze was cold and distant. The silence that filled the entryway made João feel small. Lucas appeared shortly after, smiling and welcoming him. But before they could exchange words, João noticed the suspicious look of Lucas's father standing at a distance. The man, tall and elegant, was scrutinizing him with a severe expression, almost as if questioning what a boy like him was doing there. Inside the house, the luxury was overwhelming. Soft rugs covered the marble floors. The walls were adorned with artwork João had only seen in books, and chandeliers glittered with crystal. Everything exuded wealth. Every detail reminded João of how far apart their worlds were. Even with Lucas by his side, laughing and showing him every corner of the house, the tension was palpable. João felt the weight of the suspicious looks on him, as if every movement he made was being watched. The initial awe began to be overshadowed by a growing discomfort. There, in the midst of so much luxury, João started to wonder if he truly belonged in that place. João was still absorbing his surroundings when he was caught off guard by an imposing presence. Lucas's father, with firm steps, entered the room where the two friends were. His posture was rigid, making the air in the mansion, already heavy, feel suffocating. He wore a flawless suit, and his eyes, behind thin glasses, examined João as if he were a blemish in the midst of the house's grandeur. "So you're João, my son's friend?" the man said, his tone barely masking his disdain. João, trying to stay composed, nodded and gave a timid "yes, sir." But the smile he attempted to offer wasn't returned. The man looked him up and down, as if measuring every penny the boy would never have. There was tension in the air, an evident discomfort. Lucas, though he tried to hide it, also seemed to feel the heaviness that had settled in the room. He jumped in, attempting to lighten the mood with his usual enthusiasm. "Dad, João's the top student in our class. Did you know he won the essay contest?" Lucas's father, however, didn't seem impressed. His gaze remained fixed on João, as if the boy's mere presence was an offense. "Really?" he asked, his tone making it clear that this information was of no importance to him. To him, what mattered was that João didn't belong in this world. João felt his face flush, a mixture of shame and discomfort creeping over him. He knew he didn't have the right clothes, didn't speak with the same confidence as the other adults in the house, and now he was facing someone who made sure to remind him of that. "I hope you understand what it means to be here in my house," the man continued coldly. "We're not used to having certain types of people in this environment." His words, laden with contempt, hung in the air. João, silent, felt the weight of each one. His fingers tightened around his backpack, his only connection to the world outside. Lucas, sensing the tension, tried to steer the conversation in a different direction, but it was too late. For João, the mansion's brilliance was beginning to fade, replaced by a much more bitter reality. He wasn't welcome there. Dinner felt like the pinnacle of awkwardness. The table was massive, made of dark, polished wood, with silver candelabras reflecting the soft lights from the chandelier above. Fine china, crystal glasses, and cutlery João had never seen in his life were arranged with perfect precision. Every detail of the table screamed of a reality far from his own. João sat beside Lucas, trying to mimic his friend's flawless posture as the servants brought out the dishes. He watched in silence, not wanting to draw attention to himself. But the feeling of being out of place lingered. He tried to hide his unease, but it was hard to ignore the weight of the stares around the table. Lucas's father, seated at the head of the table, observed João's every move. Between bites, he threw out comments that at first seemed innocent but quickly revealed their true purpose. "So, João, what does your father do for a living?" he asked, a cold smile on his face. João hesitated, feeling a knot form in his throat. "He works as a construction worker, sir." The man nodded slowly with a look that clearly showed his disdain. I imagine that must be difficult. So many limitations." He said the word, limitations, with a tone of superiority, almost as if he were explaining something too obvious to a child. João tried to ignore it, but the sting of humiliation was impossible to avoid. The other adults at the table carried on with their conversations, pretending not to notice the discomfort, while Lucas's father continued, seeming to relish in the situation. "You see, Lucas, that's why I always stress the importance of surrounding yourself with people who can elevate you. It's important to understand that unfortunately not everyone has the same opportunities." His voice, heavy with condescension, grew louder with each word. Lucas looked at his father, trying to hide his discomfort, but the atmosphere was already suffocating. João, on the other hand, pressed his lips together, feeling the heat rise in his face. His stomach, once eager for the meal, now felt queasy. The food in front of him seemed untouched, and every minute at that dinner table turned into silent torture. "But tell me, João," the man continued with a false kindness that only accentuated his disdain, "what are your plans for the future? What do you intend to do? Given your circumstances, of course." He emphasized the last phrase with a slight smile, making it clear he didn't expect anything remarkable from the boy. João looked down at his plate, feeling the weight of the words. He knew that no matter how hard he tried, he wouldn't be able to change this man's perception of him and his family. In that moment, his friendship with Lucas seemed fragile in the face of the invisible barriers Lucas's father had erected between them. João felt the weight of the father's words like bricks pressing down on his chest. Every sentence carried a silent judgment on his life, his family, and their limitations, but he took a deep breath. His first instinct was to get up and leave, to run away from the situation, to escape the looks full of superiority. But something inside him, a strength he didn't know he had, kept him seated. He gripped his fork tightly, staring at his plate for a moment, but then raised his head. He wouldn't respond with anger, nor would he let the man's disdain break him. That humiliation was a reflection of the man's prejudice, not of who he was. João knew who he was. He knew the value of his family's work and the love he received at home. No one could take that from him. "I'm not sure yet what I'll do, sir," he responded calmly, his voice steady but respectful. "But I'm working hard to learn and grow. I want to do something I'm proud of, something that makes my family proud of me." The silence that followed was palpable. Everyone at the table felt the shift in the air. Lucas looked at his friend with newfound admiration, while his father, for a brief moment, seemed caught off guard by the boy's response. The expectation that João would either crumble or respond with aggression had been thwarted by his serenity and dignity. Lucas's father opened his mouth to say something, but hesitated, perhaps realizing that any further provocation would be pointless. João's emotional control had changed the dynamic. He hadn't fallen into the power play the man had set up. In fact, his maturity made the wealthy father seem small, awkward in his attempt to belittle someone so young and so full of courage. The looks around the table started to shift. Some of the servants, who had previously gazed at João with disdain, now seemed to regard him with a certain respect. João kept his gaze steady, but without bitterness. There was no need for revenge or confrontation. He understood that sometimes the greatest strength lies in staying calm when the world around you tries to bring you down. Lucas, who had been silent until then, finally broke the tension. "João is the smartest guy in our class, Dad. He can achieve whatever he wants," he said with a conviction João hadn't expected. Lucas's father just muttered something inaudible, clearly unsettled by the turn of events he hadn't foreseen. In that moment, João knew he had won. Not a victory over Lucas's father, but an internal victory over his own fear and insecurity. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone except himself. Lucas was fiddling with his plate, his eyes fixed on the food, though his mind was far from the dinner table. A deep sense of discomfort was growing inside him, as if his father's harsh words still echoed in the room. He felt ashamed, an intense shame that went beyond the cruel remarks. He was torn inside. On one hand, his father, the man who had always guided him, who he admired. On the other hand, João, his true friend, who had never judged him for who he was, regardless of his wealth. As João maintained his dignity in the face of provocation, Lucas felt small. Should he have said something? Should he have defended his friend? But how could he confront his own father, the man who had always dictated what was right or wrong, who had taught him to be strong but now seemed so cruel? Lucas glanced at João. His friend was calm, in a way Lucas didn't expect. There was something in João's posture, a serenity that both impressed and made Lucas feel guilty. Their friendship had always been marked by equality. They laughed together, studied together, shared secrets. But now, that friendship felt off balance. It was as if the weight of the situation had fallen entirely on João's shoulders. "Is my father right?" Lucas wondered, lost in thought. No, something deep inside him screamed that he wasn't. He knew João was more than any label his father could place on him. But how could he say that? How could he stand up to his own father without losing his respect? With each passing second, the silence between the three of them grew more unbearable. Lucas wanted to break it, wanted to apologize to João, but the words wouldn't come. He felt the conflict within him growing. As much as he wanted to fix things, he was trapped between loyalty to his father and the truth he saw in his friend. He knew that regardless of what he said that night, his friendship with João would never be the same. The weight of that choice haunted him, and soon he would have to decide where his true loyalty lay. As the night wore on and silence took over the table, Lucas's father, Mr. Arnaldo, placed his silverware on the porcelain plate with a light clink. He glanced at João from the corner of his eye, his gaze narrowing. At first, his harsh words had been spoken to reaffirm his authority. After all, he always believed that wealth and power were the only measures of success. But something in the boy's reaction made him hesitate. João, with his calm demeanor and steady gaze, hadn't broken. He hadn't given in to the provocations. He didn't try to defend himself or bow to the humiliation. To Mr. Arnaldo, this was unusual. He was used to seeing people in João's position react with either submission or anger, desperately trying to fit into a world that wasn't theirs. But this boy, he didn't fit into those molds. As he wiped his mouth with his napkin, Mr. Arnaldo found himself reflecting. Something he didn't do often. What made João so different? And why did it bother him so much? He, who had built his life behind high, distant walls, protecting his family from what he deemed an inferior world, now found himself facing a young man who, despite having nothing, seemed prouder of who he was than many people Mr. Arnaldo knew in his own circles. João's silence was deafening. He didn't need words to show who he was. That quiet dignity, that resilience in the face of offense. It was unsettling Mr. Arnaldo in ways he hadn't expected. He started to realize that perhaps he had misjudged. Perhaps there was more value in courage and dignity than in wealth and material possessions. Of course, he couldn't admit this out loud. Not at that moment, and certainly not in front of his son. But deep down, a small seed of doubt about his worldview had been planted that night. And despite his impassive expression, he knew that seed would eventually grow. As the evening drew to a close, the night felt longer than expected. João, keeping his dignity intact, prepared to leave. He knew that the moment of departure carried more than just the end of a visit. There was something in the air, a weight, an imperceptible shift that resonated between him, Lucas, and Mr. Arnaldo. With steady steps and his head held high, João stood up from the table. He politely thanked them for the dinner, as he had been taught by his parents. No words of resentment escaped his lips, and the pride in his chest was almost palpable. Lucas, still feeling torn, walked his friend to the door. He knew the dinner hadn't gone as he had hoped. The promise of an enjoyable evening had been stained by his father's comments. But deep down, Lucas understood something more profound about his friend. Mr. Arnaldo, for his part, remained quiet. He didn't apologize, of course. His pride was too great for that. But as João crossed the threshold, he observed him in a different way, as if seeing someone he would never fully understand. That boy, without resources or the opportunities his son had, carried within him an unshakable strength. And to Mr. Arnaldo, that was something no amount of money could buy. Before they said goodbye, Lucas approached João. In a low voice, almost as if it were a secret between them, he promised that nothing would change. "Our friendship won't end because of this," he assured, with a sincere handshake. João only gave a small smile, knowing that the true test of their friendship was only just beginning. He left the mansion the same way he had entered, head held high, but now with the certainty that, while the world may be divided by wealth, it's character that truly makes the difference. As João walked through the moonlit streets, his emotions were still raw. The contrast between his friend's mansion and his own home felt more evident than ever. But instead of feeling defeated, a wave of reflection washed over him. What had happened that night wasn't just a moment of humiliation, but an opportunity for growth. He thought about the way he reacted to Lucas's father's disdain. Instead of giving in to anger or sadness, he chose to maintain his dignity. That choice wasn't just about not retaliating. It was a statement of who he truly was. With each step, João recalled Lucas's confused and worried expression, and how that moment could become a turning point in their friendship. The strength he had shown at the dinner table would not go unnoticed. There was something deeper at play as well. João believed that his attitude might have planted a seed of change in Mr. Arnaldo's mind. The man who once seemed so certain of his beliefs about status and wealth was now beginning to question those ideas. It was a small but powerful legacy João had left behind. When he finally arrived home, João felt different. He wasn't just a poor boy in a world of wealth. He was someone who had stood his ground with dignity in the face of adversity. And with this new perspective, an unshakable confidence began to blossom within him. He knew that his worth wasn't measured by material possessions, but by the character he carried. As he looked toward the future, João felt not only stronger, but also hopeful. He had become an example, not just for Lucas, but for everyone around him, showing that true wealth lies in dignity and the courage to be yourself. What would you do in John's place? Would you have the same answer, or would you have answered differently? Leave a comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, and press the bell icon so you don't miss any stories like this.